Hi, my name's Tim Bayne, and this is the fifth in a series of lectures that I'm recording for the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies on the problem, or rather problems, of other minds. My aim in this lecture is to explain and motivate an approach to the problem of other minds that Nick Shea at the Institute of Philosophy in London and I have developed over the last couple of years, building on work that other people have done. We call it the natural kind approach or natural kind method. But before I get to the natural kind approach, let me first review the problem that this approach is trying to solve and why some of the alternative solutions to it fail, or at least, in my view, are seriously problematic. The problem that we're considering here is what I've called the scientific problem of other minds. At its heart is the question of whether and how we can adjudicate debates about the distribution of consciousness in contested cases, that is, cases in which our pre-theoretical measures failed to deliver a decisive and clear-cut verdict about the absence or presence of consciousness. Some contested cases involve other human beings, such as infants and individuals who are non-responsive due to severe brain damage. Other contested cases involve non-human animals, and still others involve artificially intelligent systems. As I noted in a previous lecture, developments in our capacity to measure brain activity have allowed us to make some progress with respect to this problem. But these methods still involve our ordinary pre-theoretical measures of consciousness, such as voluntary behavior and communication. And because of this, although they're not reliant on our capacity, on the capacity of the individuals in question to produce overt behavioral responses. However, in general, we won't be able to make progress in addressing the problem of other minds by relying on our ordinary pre-theoretical markers or indicators of consciousness, such as verbal report and intentional behavior. Instead, we'll need to go beyond those markers and supplement them in important ways. So the question is, how might we do that in a principled manner? One attractive proposal here is that what's required is a theory of consciousness. If we knew how conscious states and processes were grounded in neural activity, and if we knew what the causal or functional profile of a conscious state was, and in particular, how the causal or functional profile of conscious states differs from that of unconscious states, then we would be in an excellent position to answer questions about consciousness in contested cases. The problem, of course, is that the kind of theory that we'd need is a comprehensive theory of consciousness, not a theory whose scope is restricted to neurotypical adult humans. After all, a theory of consciousness in adult neurotypical humans wouldn't be much help in addressing the problem of consciousness in contested cases. The problem, of course, is that in order to develop a comprehensive theory of consciousness, it looks as though we would first need to know what the distribution of consciousness is. In other words, we need to have addressed the problem of contested cases. And if that's right, then we seem to be caught in a vicious kind of circularity. On the one hand, we need a comprehensive theory of consciousness to solve the problem of other minds. On the other hand, we need to solve the problem of other minds in order to develop a comprehensive theory of consciousness. So that's the challenge. In the previous lecture, I examined two proposals for addressing this circularity challenge. The first is what I call the axiomatic approach. So an approach to the measurement of consciousness that's associated most closely with the integrated information theory of consciousness, or IIT, and it involves an appeal to what are called phenomenological axioms. These are putatively self-evidently true theses about the nature and structure of consciousness that are identifiable from the first-person perspective. With a set of phenomenological axioms in hand, the thought goes, we could then figure out what kinds of physical states and processes are necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And in the previous lecture, I spent quite a bit of time looking at the axioms posited by IIT, and in particular, one axiom, the axiom of integration. I suggested that it's not at all clear what these axioms mean, or that they do indeed qualify as phenomenological axioms. More importantly, I expressed doubt about the axiomatic method more generally. There seem to be very few phenomenological axioms, and whatever axioms there might be are surely not sufficiently detailed to ground a substantive theory of consciousness. The second method for developing a comprehensive theory of consciousness that I considered is the correlational method, or the correlational approach. The basic idea here is that we don't need a general theory of consciousness in order to know what the distribution of consciousness in contested cases is, but can simply redeploy a theory of consciousness that's adequate to human experience and apply it to other domains, to immature human beings, non-human animals, and artificially intelligent systems. I call this the correlational approach because the idea is that correlations between neurofunctional properties on the one hand and consciousness on the other hand, in our case, provide a basis on which to ascribe consciousness to other creatures. We can correlate, go from, as it were, correlations that apply to us to other kinds of systems. As I pointed out in the previous lecture, the fundamental problem with the correlational method is that it's unclear which of the various features that are associated with consciousness in our case are the relevant ones for making an ascription of consciousness in the case of other systems. In other words, it's not clear which of the correlations that obtain in our case are the ones that matter. Various kinds of neurofunctional properties are correlated with consciousness in our case, and which of these properties correlates with consciousness in other kinds of creatures, and which of them is only contingently related to consciousness, is related to consciousness in us, but not in other kinds of species. In developing this worry, it's common for theorists to focus on the contrast between functional properties and their neural realizers, but that's really only one aspect of the problem, and the fundamental problem here is significantly more general than the contrast between functional dimensions of consciousness and their neural realizers. Even with respect to the functional correlates of consciousness, there's a question of which of those correlates corresponds to the essential dimensions of consciousness and which are merely contingently related to consciousness as it occurs in us. These considerations regarding the correlational approach are rather abstract, so it might be helpful to put the point in terms of a particular theory of consciousness, the global workspace theory. And this is just to amplify some comments I made in the previous lecture. The basic idea behind the global workspace theory is that representations become conscious when they enter a global workspace and are thus available for use by a wide range of consuming systems, such as those involved in report, the voluntary control of behavior, memory consolidation, and the like. Understood in correlational terms, the idea is that we first show that the global workspace theory is true of adult human beings, i.e. global workspace activation correlates with consciousness in our case, and we then generalize beyond our own case to cases of the kind that we're interested in, contested cases, such as individuals suffering from brain damage, human infants, non-human animals, and artificially intelligent systems. The challenge, of course, is that the global workspace approach, understood in terms of this correlational method, needs to provide an account of what a workspace might be like, or must be like, in order to qualify as global in the consciousness supporting sense of the term. The workspaces that we see in human infants, non-human animals, AI systems will resemble our workspace in certain respects, but not in others. And the question is which dimensions of variation matter when it comes to the ascription of consciousness, and which dimensions of variation are immaterial. Left to its own devices, it's not clear that the correlation approach really has the resources to answer that question in a principled manner. Okay, so where does this leave us? I've suggested that neither the axiomatic method nor the correlational method provides us with a plausible response to the circularity challenge, and we're going to have to look elsewhere if we're to find a solution to that problem. What I want to do in this lecture is sketch an alternative approach that I think does address, or at least provides the best hope for addressing, the circularity challenge. And this approach, as I suggested earlier, is the natural kind approach. Now, at the heart of the natural kind approach is the idea that consciousness can be treated, or should be treated, as a natural kind. So let me begin by saying a bit about what a natural kind is, as I'm using that term here. The intuitive idea is that a natural kind cuts nature at its joints. Natural kind categories group things together on the basis of commonalities that reflect or are due to an underlying common nature. And a natural kind category doesn't group things together merely on the basis of superficial similarities or on the basis of features that are baked into a definition of the category itself in the way in which what we might call nominal kinds do. So consider the category of things that are both read and manufactured in Italy. This label, this term, picks out a certain class of objects, namely anything that's both read and made in Italy, but the members of this class don't share a common underlying nature. It is, if you like, a nominal kind. By contrast, the class of objects picked out by the English word apple is a natural kind, for the members of this class do have a common underlying nature. One way to appreciate the contrast between natural kinds and purely nominal kinds is to consider inductive inference. Suppose someone shows you, say, 5 apples, chosen at random from amongst the various apples in the world. You're then told that you will be shown another apple and are asked to predict as many properties of it as you can. I think you'll be able to do this task quite well. For the apples that you will have shown, that you've been shown, will have many properties in common, and the vast majority of these properties will also be had by the 6th apple that you're shown. The properties that apples have in common are not simply superficial ones, such as size and shape, but also involve their underlying features, their chemical properties, their biological properties. You'll be able to predict how the 6th apple will react when, say, it's cut with a knife, when it's immersed in boiling water, when it's put into a pie, what happens when people eat it, what happens when goats eat it, and the like. By contrast, induction won't be nearly as reliable with respect to members of the class of objects that are both read and made in Italy. Take 5 members of this class of objects at random, for example, a Ferrari, a can of Italian tomatoes, a pair of red shoes that have been made in Italy, and so on, and chances are they won't have many interesting properties in common over and above the fact that they're made in red and that they're red and made in Italy. If these objects do happen to have properties in common, if those 5 objects do happen to have properties in common, chances are those properties are unlikely to be shared by a 6th member of the class of red objects made in Italy that's chosen at random. So what these examples illustrate, I think, is a very important point, in that there's a close connection between being a natural kind and the reliability, the usefulness of induction. Writ large, science is concerned with natural kinds, and much scientific work can be understood in terms of the search of categories that better reflect the joints in nature that are natural kinds. There's a great more to be said about the notion of a natural kind, but I hope that these brief comments convey at least the basic gist of the idea, enough for us to turn to the natural kind approach itself and to ask how it hopes to address the problem of other minds. We can think of the natural kind approach as involving the following 4 steps. First, there's what I might call the marker assembly step. Here we assemble those features, behavioral, cognitive, potentially even neural, that are associated with consciousness. Some of these features might be pre-theoretically associated with consciousness. Others might be associated with consciousness on the basis of a scientific investigation, what we've found so far from the science of consciousness. The second step is a causal modeling step, in which causal modeling is used to identify the properties, or potentially one property, likely to be properties, which causally explain the markers identified in step 1. Explains, more importantly, why those markers co-vary in the ways they do, and why in certain situations they might dissociate from each other. Let's call that property, let's suppose it's a single property, K. The third step in the natural kind approach is the marker revision step. Here, the list of markers that we identified in step 1, the first step, is amended in light of the identification of K, that is the underlying property that accounts for the way in which those initial set of markers cluster together. Properties that are strong indicators of K are included within our list of markers of consciousness, while properties that aren't strongly correlated or with K, that aren't strong indicators of K, are downgraded, are given less weight in our list of markers of consciousness. And finally, there's the application step, in which our amended list of markers is used to identify the presence or absence of consciousness in contested cases. So an example might help to put a bit of flesh on these rather abstract principles and points. Consider a familiar case in which the natural kind method is being used, the study of water. Prior to the scientific revolution, we had various ways of determining whether or not a sample of some substance was water. For example, we might have taken it to be water if it was liquid at a certain range of temperatures, if it was transparent, if it had fallen from the sky in the form of rain or snow, if it had been taken from a river or a lake or a pond, and so on. But the scientific study of water, applying a natural kind approach to water, revealed that there's a property that underlies those various samples and that accounts for the features that it had, why they covary in various situations, and why in some contexts they fail to correlate with each other, the property of being H2O. And that discovery in turn gave rise to revisions in how the target phenomenon, namely water, can be identified in various contexts and distinguished from other kinds of substances. And now we have improved methods for identifying whether a substance is an instance of, whether a sample is an instance of water or not. Those improved measures supplement our ordinary everyday measures of water, and in some cases will trump those everyday measures of water. So something might look like water, might taste like water, might smell like water, might have fallen from the sky, but our scientific tests for measuring it might reveal that it is not, in fact, water. So there are two crucial features of the natural kind approach worth noting. That is the natural kind approach applied to consciousness. First, it would allow us to identify tests for consciousness that go beyond, that supplement the superficial tests with which we begin. Second, it would allow us to trump our ordinary pre-theoretical tests for consciousness. Those pre-theoretical measures for consciousness would lose their privileged epistemic status. Some of those tests might be retained as strong tests of consciousness because they might turn out to correlate strongly with that underlying property, the decay property that I mentioned. But the evidential value of others will be downgraded, trumped by the value of other measures which are uncovered as a result of applying the natural kind approach. Now, existing consciousness research contains a great many tests that could be incorporated into the natural kind approach. And let me mention a few potential candidates here. One such candidate is trace conditioning, a kind of conditioning that can be contrasted with delay conditioning. In delay conditioning, a puff of air is administered to the eye during the occurrence of a tone. After the start of a tone, hence the term delay conditioning. In contrast, in trace conditioning, an air puff occurs shortly after a tone has stopped. The evidence indicates that trace conditioning requires awareness of the contingency between the tone and the air puff, whereas delay conditioning doesn't. Thus, one could treat delay conditioning as a marker, trace conditioning as a marker of consciousness, and the delay conditioning wouldn't be treated as a marker of consciousness. Another phenomenon that might be incorporated into the natural kind approach is the attentional blink. This phenomenon occurs when subjects appear to be unconscious of the second of two stimuli, where the first stimulus is attended. For example, the two stimuli might be visual objects that are presented in close succession. The first stimulus is attended, and the second stimulus is presented immediately after the first. So by looking at the attentional blink and a failure to be conscious of the second stimulus that is presented immediately after the first, one might treat that as a marker of consciousness within the natural kind approach. A third phenomenon that might be incorporated into the natural kind approach involves a phenomenon known as stem completion. Stem completion occurs when the prior presentation of a word influences how subjects go on to complete a word stem that's subsequently presented to them. For example, if subjects are presented with a list of words and are then presented with the word stem ELA, ... that they then have to complete with a word, they're more likely to complete the stem with the word elastic if the previous list had contained the word elastic than if it didn't. And this effect applies even when the word elastic is presented unconsciously, even when subjects report that they weren't aware of the word elastic. However, only if the word is presented consciously can subjects follow an instruction to avoid completing a stem with a presented word. So it's the non-completion, it's the deliberate non-completion of a word stem with a particular word that seems to require awareness. So those are three phenomena: trace conditioning, the attentional blink, and word stem completion, or rather word stem non-completion, which might be treated as markers of consciousness within the ambit of the natural kind approach. As well as these, as it were, functional phenomenon, more direct measures of brain properties might also be integrated into the natural kind approach. For example, gamma band neural synchrony, activation of a global workspace, integrating, for example, perceptual areas with prefrontal cortex, existence of corticothalamical loops, locally recurrent processing within cortex, and so on and so forth. Any of the things that are currently in the mix as correlates of consciousness. Now I'm going to consider objections to the natural kind approach shortly. We're going to focus on 4 objections, but before I turn to them, I want to briefly consider how the natural kind approach differs from the other 2 approaches that we looked at last in the previous lecture, the axiomatic approach and the correlational approach. Let's begin by contrasting the natural kind approach with the axiomatic approach. First, the axiomatic approach is concerned only with features of the target phenomena that are putatively essential to it, whereas the natural kind approach doesn't distinguish between features that are essential to consciousness and those that are only contingently associated with it. Everything goes into the mix. So just to see why the natural kind approach doesn't fixate on features of consciousness that are essential to it, consider a domain in which it's been very successfully applied, the study of disease. Many of the signs and symptoms of a disease aren't essential to it, and yet the interrogation of those signs and symptoms is often extremely useful for identifying its presence. Another contrast between the natural kind approach and the axiomatic approach is that the natural kind approach doesn't restrict itself to phenomenological dimensions of consciousness. It doesn't restrict itself to dimensions of consciousness that are accessible from the first-person perspective in the way that the axiomatic approach. Instead, the natural kind approach considers functional, causal, information processing, neural dimensions of consciousness. Anything that seems to be closely associated, closely correlated with consciousness is fair game to be thrown into the mix. And that allows the proponent of the natural kind approach to consider such things as a relationship between consciousness and such things as attention, working memory, metacognition, reportability, voluntary control of behavior, and so on. The contrast between the natural kind approach and the correlational approach is perhaps a little less obvious, but I think it's no less important. The central point of difference here is that the natural kind approach provides, or at least hopes to provide, a principal way of going beyond the sample of conscious states with which we started, that is, consciousness in neurotypical adult humans, and for saying which points of similarity matter when it comes to the description of consciousness in other kinds of systems, and which points of similarity don't matter. The important points of similarity will be those that track the underlying feature that is discovered by applying the natural kind approach, this feature, this property K that I mentioned, assuming, of course, that there is such an underlying feature. By contrast, the correlational approach has no grounds for deciding how to generalize beyond the kinds of cases with which we started. So what I'm going to do now is turn to objections to the natural kind approach. And here it's fair to say that I think, although the view has been discussed in the literature for some years now, arguably it goes back to an influential paper in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences by Ned Block, I think it's still fair to say that the view is something of a minority one within the study of consciousness. And on the face of things, that's a rather puzzling fact, because the natural kind approach is orthodoxy within many parts of science, and in particular, the biological sciences, which is where one would naturally expect to find the science of consciousness. And that's noteworthy, I think, because it suggests that if there's a problem with the natural kind approach applied to consciousness, that problem must derive ultimately from features that are distinctive of consciousness. The problem can't be with the natural kind approach per se, but must be due to features involving consciousness. So in what remains of this lecture, I'm going to consider 4 lectures that might be given for thinking that the natural kind approach can't be successfully applied to consciousness. The first of these objections argues that the approach can't be correct because of features that derive from the concept of consciousness, features involving the concept of consciousness. So what kind of concept is the concept of consciousness? The standard answer to this question, at least in contemporary philosophy of mind, is that the concept of consciousness is a very distinctive kind of concept. It's what's known as a phenomenal concept. Theorists disagree about exactly how phenomenal concepts should be understood, but the basic idea here is that a phenomenal concept is a concept of experience or consciousness that categorizes experience or categorizes consciousness in terms of what it's like to be conscious, in terms of what it's like to have the relevant kind of experiential state. So, for example, the phenomenal concept of pain refers to pains not in virtue of their functional profile, how they're related to behavior, their neural basis, or anything like that, but refers to pains in terms of what it's like to be in pain. Thus understood, phenomenal concepts are taken typically to have three distinguishing features. First, they can be self-applied directly in virtue of being in this relevant kind of state. For example, the thought here is one is justified in applying the concept of pain to oneself merely on the basis of the fact that one is in pain. That's not typically true of other kinds of concepts. For example, one can't apply the concept of hepatitis to oneself merely in virtue of the fact that one has hepatitis. One could have hepatitis, but not be in a position to justifiably apply the concept of hepatitis to oneself. Second, phenomenal concepts have distinctive acquisition conditions. Roughly speaking, you can't acquire the concept pain, the phenomenal concept pain, unless you've actually been in pain, or at least in a state that's extremely similar to pain. Again, that's not typically true of other kinds of concepts. For example, you can acquire the concept hepatitis without having had hepatitis, and that's true of most of us who have the concept hepatitis haven't had hepatitis. Third, and perhaps most importantly for certain respects, phenomenal concepts are inferentially isolated from functional and physical concepts. And it's this inferential isolation which explains or underwrites a number of very important thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. For example, inverted spectra scenarios, in which, for example, people take seriously the idea that things which look red to one person might look green to another person, so that the color qualia are systematically inverted between individuals. Or the zombie scenario, in which it seemed conceivable to many people, that one could have a physical or functional twin that has no conscious states, that has no phenomenal properties. Natural kind concepts, in contrast, aren't inferentially isolated from physical and functional concepts. They don't have that kind of inferential isolation that's exemplified by phenomenal concepts. Now, although the existence of phenomenal concepts isn't uncontroversial, most contemporary philosophers of mind not only think that we have phenomenal concepts, they view them as central to the way in which consciousness is ordinarily conceptualized. So thus, it's a matter of some interest, some importance, whether a commitment to phenomenal concepts is at odds with the natural kind approach, and many people have suggested that it might be. How might such an argument go? Well, here's one version, is a very natural version, I think, of the worry. The first premise is this: the concept of consciousness is a phenomenal concept. Second, if the concept of consciousness is a phenomenal concept, then it's not a natural kind concept. The thought here being a concept can't be both a phenomenal concept and a natural kind concept. From that, it follows, third premise, that consciousness isn't a natural kind concept. The concept of consciousness isn't a natural kind concept. And the fourth premise is this: that the natural kind approach could be successful only if the concept of consciousness were a natural kind concept. Put all those claims together, and you get the conclusion that the natural kind approach can't be successful. Now, central to this argument is the idea of a natural kind concept. So we've talked about phenomenal concepts. Let's talk briefly about natural kind concepts. How should that notion be understood? Well, one conception of a natural kind concept simply identifies it with any concept that refers to a natural kind property. And on this understanding, the concept of consciousness would qualify as a natural kind concept if, and only if, consciousness itself is a natural kind. But on this reading of what it is to be a natural kind concept, the argument is surely guilty of begging the question against the natural kind approach. Consciousness might turn out not to be a natural kind property, But for the phenomenal concept argument, the argument that we've been considering here, promised to deliver a different kind of objection to the natural kind approach, one that purported to show not just that the approach might fail, but that it's doomed to fail. And if the argument's to make good on that promise, it must employ a different conception of what it is to be a natural kind concept. There is a different conception, I think, and the following comments from a paper by Peter Carruthers, paper entitled Comparative Psychology Without Consciousness, points us in the direction of what that concept, what that conception of a natural kind concept might be. So here's a longish quote from that paper. What everyone has agreed on since Kripke, Carruthers says, is that terms referring to conscious mental states aren't used as natural kind terms. In contrast, he says, it's generally agreed that our concepts for substances like water are natural kind ones. Even before we knew anything about chemistry, we used the concept water to refer to the underlying nature or essence of the recognizable stuff that fills our lakes and rivers, H2O, and it turned out that the very same stuff that presents as ice in some circumstances, frozen water, and as mist in others, evaporated water. But our concepts of the felt qualities of our conscious experiences aren't like that, Carruthers says. We don't use them with the intention of referring to whatever natural kind underlies those experiences, whatever that might turn out to be, and however that kind might be presented in other creatures. On the contrary, we mean to refer to just those felt qualities themselves. End of quote. On this reading, a natural kind concept is a concept where the user means or intends in some way to refer to a natural kind. And we can broaden this conception of a natural kind concept to include not just intentions, but whatever it is in the thinker's conceptions and use of the concept that operates to fix its referent. So in what follows, I'll take a natural kind concept. I'll understand a natural kind concept in this sense. I'll understand it to be a concept such that it must refer to a natural kind if it refers at all, and it refers to a natural kind in virtue of the fact that, in some sense, users intend or mean or conceive of the property in question as a natural kind property. Okay, with that point in mind, let's return to the phenomenal concept argument. How might we respond to it? Now, some might be inclined to reject the claim that the concept of consciousness is a phenomenal concept. One way to do that, of course, is to deny that there are any phenomenal concepts at all. That's a position that will appeal to behaviorists who are subjective of the idea that there are any subjective states that we would need to refer to, and to Wittgensteinians who are skeptical of the idea that it would be possible to refer to subjective states in a purely kind of private way that involves first-person ostension. This approach will also appeal to those who allow that there are purely subjective states and who also allow that we could represent such states to ourselves in this first-person manner, but doubt that such representations could qualify as genuinely conceptual. Another way in which you might reject the first premise of the argument allows that we actually do have phenomenal concepts, but that those concepts are associated only with fine-grained conscious states, such as experiences of sensory qualities, emotions, or bodily states, and that the concept of consciousness per se is not a phenomenal concept. However, I'm not inclined to endorse either of these two ways of rejecting the first premise. I'm happy to accept that there are phenomenal concepts, and I'm also happy to accept that the concept of consciousness is itself a phenomenal concept. So if I'm going to reject the phenomenal concept argument, I need to do so on different grounds. Another response to the phenomenal concept argument is to challenge the assumption that the concept of consciousness would need to be a natural kind concept in order for the natural kind approach to succeed. This response will be attractive to those who doubt that referential intentions play a central role in fixing the referent of a concept. The idea here is that even if those who employ the concept of consciousness don't intend to refer to a natural kind, perhaps it could turn out that the phenomenon to which they do refer is in fact a natural kind property. I'm not myself terribly inclined to endorse this response, but it's certainly worth noting here. More generally, it's worth noting that there's a gap between claims about the nature of the concept of consciousness and claims about the nature of consciousness itself. My preferred response to the phenomenal concept argument, to the phenomenal concept objection, is to challenge the second premise of the argument, which states that if consciousness is a phenomenal concept, then it's not a natural kind concept. Now, on the face of things, this claim seems pretty plausible. After all, phenomenal concepts are naturally contrasted with natural kind concepts. Phenomenal concepts are self-applied directly in virtue of being in a state of the type that is referred to, that they refer to. They have distinctive acquisition conditions, and they're inferentially isolated from functional and physical concepts, whereas natural kind concepts, at least prototypical natural kind concepts, have none of these features. How then, one might wonder, could consciousness be both a phenomenal concept and a natural kind concept? Well, insofar as the concept of consciousness has the features just listed, it certainly isn't a canonical natural kind concept. It's different in important ways from other natural kind concepts, such as water or hepatitis and the like. However, it seems to me that the concept of consciousness might qualify as both a phenomenal concept and a natural kind concept in an extended sense of that term. For one could think of the property that one is able to directly self-describe as a natural kind property, much like any other biological property. And here I think it's worth attending quite closely to the passage from Carruthers that I quoted earlier, which contrasts intending to refer to a natural kind that underlines experience with intending to refer to felt experiential qualities. Now, it seems to me that this contrast is a false one. For one could intend to refer to both of these features, and it seems to me that's a very natural way to think about reference to consciousness. If one regards consciousness as a natural kind, as a biological natural kind in the way that hepatitis, for example, is, then one will intend to refer both to felt experiential qualities and to the natural kind those experiential qualities corresponds to. So the upshot of the phenomenal concept objection, it seems to me, is that although the concept of consciousness isn't a canonical natural kind, it could be a natural kind concept nonetheless, and that's consistent with it being a phenomenal concept. Let me turn now to a second objection to the natural kind approach, an objection that can in some ways be thought of as a variant of the phenomenal concept objection, because it too focuses quite centrally on features of phenomenal concepts. But unlike the previous objection, which attempted to derail the natural kind approach on the grounds that the concept of consciousness isn't a natural kind concept, this objection focuses on the idea that phenomenal concepts provide us with some kind of insight into the very nature of consciousness itself, and that the insight that they deliver is at odds with the tenability or the assumptions of the natural kind approach. The idea that the self-application of a phenomenal concept can reveal something substantive, something deep about the nature of consciousness, is an oft expressed thought in the consciousness literature, although different authors put the point in slightly different ways. So Joseph Levine says, a successful account of phenomenal concepts should explain the especially immediate, and this is a quote, the especially immediate and intimate cognitive relation between phenomenal concepts and their objects that is afforded by phenomenal concepts. David Chalmers describes a phenomenal concept as a concept that picks out its referent in terms of its intrinsic nature. Martin Niederrumelin says that our grasp of phenomenal properties goes via our grasp of phenomenal concepts, and that to grasp a property is to understand what having the property essentially consists in. Terry Horgan and John Teenson claim that when one thinks of a phenomenal property via a phenomenal concept, one thinks of it, quote, directly as it is in itself. And finally, Philip Goff writes, phenomenal concepts reveal the essence of the states they denote. So the general idea here that seems to be expressed in each of these statements is often put in terms of the notion of revelation. Phenomenal concepts reveal the nature, the essential, the intrinsic nature of their reference, i.e. of consciousness. It's useful to, I think, explore this idea with reference to a particular example. Here's the example of pain. And here's how Philip Goff puts the point about revelation as applied to pain. You know, he says, exactly what your pain is. You know what it is for someone to feel pain in precisely that way just by attending to pain and thinking about it in terms of how it feels. There is nothing, he says, in any way hidden from you about the reality of how you're feeling when you deploy the phenomenal concept pain and apply it to your own pains. Nor is it possible that you're not really feeling that way. And that's because the feeling is right there for you in such a way that its reality cannot be doubted. End of quotation from Goff. So far you might think, so good. Revelation in this sense seems pretty plausible, but why might it be regarded as problematic for the natural kind approach? There are, I think, various ways in which one might try to articulate an intuitive tension here, but I think the worry that some theorists have in mind goes something like this. Assume that revelation is true and that phenomenal concepts reveal the fundamental nature of consciousness. But in that case, if consciousness were a natural kind, as is assumed by the natural kind approach, then it would be apparent in the very process of deploying phenomenal concepts that it was a natural kind, and it would also be apparent, or it should also be apparent, what kind of natural kind it was. There's something about the substantive nature of that natural kind should be revealed from the first person perspective. But those facts are obviously not revealed from the first person perspective. If consciousness involves a natural kind of some sort, then that fact, and particularly the nature of that natural kind, is apparent only on the basis of extensive empirical research. Certainly not the kind of thing which can be established from the armchair merely on the basis of deploying the concept of consciousness. Thus, our imagined critic might conclude consciousness isn't a natural kind, and the natural kind approach is not tenable. Now, it won't come as any surprise that I reject this argument. I don't deny that it has a certain air of plausibility, but I think that it equivocates in a subtle and important way on the notion of what it is for the concept of consciousness to reveal the essential nature of consciousness, or what it is for the deployment of the concept of consciousness to one's own experiences to reveal the essential nature of consciousness. Here I think it's useful to distinguish two notions, or two conceptions, if you like, of revelation. Two ways of understanding the claim, Goff's claim, that there is nothing in any way hidden from you about the reality of how you're feeling when you deploy phenomenal concepts, when you apply them to your own experiences. The first notion is what we might call lightweight revelation. The other involves what we might call heavyweight revelation. Lightweight revelation focuses on the experience itself. If you're in pain, then it's true that there's something that is like for you to have that experience. We can talk about knowing what it is like in a way which depends only on a conscious subject having an experience, and doesn't depend on the subject having or using any concepts of experience. In this sense, then, the experience is indeed fully revealed to its subject. Nothing about what it's like to have an experience is hidden from its subject. If the subject's having the experience, then she really is feeling that way. She, in that sense, knows what it's like. But there's nothing more to this knowing than the having of the relevant experience. And thus, revelation in this sense, lightweight revelation, is really unexceptional. Heavyweight revelation, by contrast, is neither unexceptional nor platitudinous. It involves the deployment of concepts and the idea that the self-application of a phenomenal concept reveals substantive truths, that is, truths of the form consciousness is a natural kind. But even if consciousness is a natural kind, it's surely implausible that simply deploying the concept of consciousness would reveal that would be manifest in the self-application of the concept of consciousness. Thus, for the objection from revelation to work, the notion of revelation must be understood in this heavyweight sense. But it's pretty implausible, it seems to me, that heavyweight revelation is true. At any rate, those who appeal to the notion of revelation give very few examples of the kind of substantive truth, propositional claims about consciousness that might be revealed by phenomenal concepts. Indeed, to the best of my knowledge, the only example of such a truth is the following one, and this is due to Goff. It's the claim that if X is pain, then X is bad. Except, if only for the sake of argument, that it is indeed a substantive truth about the nature of pain, that if X is pain, then X is bad, that claim is revealed merely on the basis of applying the concept of pain to oneself. Maybe that's true. But it's not at all clear that similar examples can be provided for knowledge of other kinds of phenomenal states, or indeed for knowledge of the concept, the property of consciousness itself. More to the point, we've been given no reason to think that whatever substantive truths might flow from the self-application of phenomenal concepts would be at odds with consciousness qualifying as their natural kind. After all, it could be true that pain is bad, and also true that pain is a natural kind. So I don't think the argument from Revelation cuts much ice against the natural kind approach. Let me move now to a third objection to the natural kind approach, what I'm going to call the starting point objection. The worry here is that the natural kind approach can't really get started because there isn't enough pre-theoretical agreement on the markers or indicators of consciousness. This objection has been articulated, developed by Ian Phillips with some sophistication. Here's a quote from Phillips. "It's undoubtedly true," he says, "that some measures, such as explicit verbal report of awareness, do provide fairly uncontroversial positive evidence of consciousness. However, such superficial consensus masks the fact that even very early on in our inquiry, we faced profound and long-standing controversies concerning how to measure consciousness. Furthermore, it's not unreasonable to think that our initial choice of evidence will make a dramatic difference to our initial sample. A difference dramatic enough to change the number of clusters eventually found by our causal modeling." So one question here, end of quote. One question here concerns how deep and widespread disagreement about the everyday pre-theoretical markers of consciousness is. Phillips is certainly right to point out that there are profound and long-standing controversies about how to measure consciousness. But it seems to me that these controversies take place against a backdrop of fairly widespread and deep agreement regarding markers of consciousness. The vast majority of theorists, for example, hold that consciousness is implicated in verbal report, intentional behavior, storage and episodic memory, and much else. A second issue concerns how sensitive the natural kind approach is to one's starting point. The starting point objection that Phillips is developing here would have most bite if the approach were highly sensitive to the starting point, to one's point of departure, with disagreement over initial samples leading rival theorists to very different natural kinds. Now, I don't think that scenario can be entirely ruled out, and perhaps different groups, if they were to begin with very different samples, would be drawn towards distinct consciousness involving natural kinds, much in the way, say, in which different research groups working on hepatitis might have alighted on different kinds of hepatitis, different natural kinds, such as hepatitis A, B, or C, if they began with different samples of the phenomenon. But it's also possible that the natural kind in question will function as a sort of attractor, particularly if there's really just one natural kind in the vicinity here, and that research groups which begin with very different sets of pre-theoretical markers of consciousness will enlarge their set of tests in different ways and eventually converge on the same underlying natural kind. In short, it seems to me that worries about our starting point, although they represent a significant challenge to the natural kind approach, they don't itself provide any reason to think the approach itself won't succeed. Seems to me the only version of this objection which would sink the natural kind approach from the get-go is one in which pre-theoretical disagreement about the markers of consciousness is so radical that there's little reason to think that the marks used by different research groups will cluster together, or that if there is a cluster, it isn't because of some single underlying natural reason. But I'm not sure that we've got any reason to think that that scenario is on the cards. Finally, I want to consider what I'm going to call the anthropocentric objection. In some ways, I think this is the most serious objection to the natural kind approach. The worry here is that the natural kind approach risks assuming that the features which characterize consciousness in human beings will reflect its essential features, whereas in fact there might be important differences between consciousness as it occurs in us, or perhaps as it occurs in some wider class of entities, mammals for example, of which we're a member, and consciousness as it occurs in other kinds of systems. The point, really, in other words, is that the approach can't avoid the worry that faces the correlational approach, that it can't avoid parochialism, that in essence, it lacks the tools to distinguish a theory of human consciousness from a general comprehensive theory of consciousness. To put it in natural kind terms, the worry is this: why should we assume that the natural kind to which consciousness in humans corresponds, if indeed there is such a thing, is the same natural kind to which consciousness corresponds in other kinds of systems, such as non-human animals or robots? Now, the heart of this objection is what we might call the uniformity thesis or the uniformity assumption. Roughly speaking, the claim that if consciousness is associated with a natural kind in us, then consciousness is associated with the same natural kind in other possible creatures. In essence, our imagined critic is rejecting that thesis or saying that we've got no good grounds to endorse it. Now, it seems to me that we've got really two options in responding to this objection. The first response, the weaker response, if you will, accepts that we actually don't have good reason to embrace the uniformity thesis, and it restricts the scope of the natural kind approach accordingly. It allows that the natural kind approach won't help us to resolve questions about the distribution of consciousness in many types of contested cases, but it insists that it would still be of some use in some kinds of contested cases. Many, perhaps, are the kinds of contested cases in which we are most interested. Most obviously, the idea here is that even restricted to human beings, the natural kind approach might allow us to speak to questions of consciousness in infants, human infants, might allow us to speak to questions of fetal consciousness, and it might allow us to speak to questions of consciousness after severe brain damage. Slightly more ambitiously, the idea is the natural kind approach might also speak to questions of consciousness in non-human animals. For even if we allow that consciousness could be associated with other natural kinds in other species, we might nevertheless have reason to think that given relations of shared descent, conservative copying, and the like, whatever natural kind that's associated with consciousness in us is likely to be associated with consciousness in other species, at least when it comes to species with whom we share a single common ancestor that was itself likely to be conscious. A second and more, and in some ways, in many ways, more ambitious response to the challenge to the objection from anthropocentrism involves defending the uniformity thesis. And the idea here is that we would be justified in using the results gleaned from applying the natural kind approach to us, that is human beings, to address questions of consciousness in very different individuals, non-human animals, especially non-human animals in which we don't have a common ancestor that is likely to be conscious, and AI systems. So why might that approach be reasonable? Well, consider what it would be for the natural kind approach to provide a successful account of human consciousness. That would require that we have identified a natural property or set of properties that does indeed successfully explain why the various features that we associate with consciousness cluster together in the ways they do and dissociate in some situations as well. But if that's right, then it seems to me that we might indeed be justified in expecting that that very property will also project over into other kinds of systems, and that we're justified in using it as the basis for our descriptions of consciousness. That, in effect, using that property isn't unjustifiably anthropocentric. Now, I recognize that there's likely to be still some kind of lingering uncertainty about the plausibility of this response. So let me conclude this lecture by addressing one possible concern, one possible source of that kind of uncertainty. The issue here, I think, is associated with the notion of multiple realizability. And here's the point. It might be thought that the natural kind approach is ultimately, fundamentally committed to some kind of mind-brain identity theory, according to which consciousness is identified, equated with some kind of brain state, some kind of neural state. And if that's the case, the worry runs, then we have immediately, from the get-go, ruled out the possibility of consciousness in systems that don't have brains, such as various kinds of AI systems, and we've made it unlikely that consciousness would obtain in creatures whose brains are very different from ours, for example, birds, reptiles, or insects. And that, it might be thought, is obviously problematic in and of itself. We shouldn't, the idea goes, dismiss the possibility of consciousness in robots or bees from the get-go. Now, I completely agree that we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of robots in consciousness or bees, the possibility of consciousness in robots or bees from the get-go. But it seems to me a mistake to assume that the natural kind approach does that. The crucial point to note here is that the natural kind approach isn't committed to the identity theory, but it's entirely possible that the natural kind to which the approach leads will instead be a functional, computational information processing a kind that we could share with creatures that either have no brains, at least have no neural states, or have brains that are very different in structure, in composition from ours. And if that's right, then it's entirely possible that even though our search for the markers of consciousness begins with the markers of human consciousness, it might deliver an account that allows us to ascribe consciousness to systems that are very different from us. To see how that might be possible, consider an example from a very different domain of science. Consider the study of nitrogen. Being a gas is characteristic of all of our ordinary interactions with nitrogen. But what we learned from studying nitrogen as a natural kind is that being a gas is one of nitrogen's contingent properties. It's a result of how nitrogen interacts with ordinary temperatures and pressures. Go outside that range of contexts, and we discover that nitrogen can exist as a liquid. Something similar could be true of consciousness. Suppose that we find out that there's some fundamental information processing property that accounts for the marks of consciousness with which we begin. We might then be able to see why the presence of a certain type of neuron, for example, von Economo neurons, is crucial to the realization of that information processing property in us and perhaps in other kinds of mammals. But that would be consistent with the same information processing property with which we're identifying or at least intimately associating consciousness, being realized in very different ways in birds, cephalopods, or even AI systems. So to conclude, the natural kind approach doesn't guarantee that we'll be able to achieve the degree of sophistication and our capacity to measure consciousness that we've been able to achieve when it comes to other natural phenomena such as hepatitis or nitrogen. But if the arguments that I've developed here are on the right track, if the defense that I've offered here of the natural kind approach is plausible, then it certainly offers us hope that we might head off in that direction. There's hope that we might be able to at least approximate that degree of precision with respect to addressing the problem of contested cases. Thanks very much.